Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm here today to talk about how to start herbs, more specifically perennial herbs, but as far as starting them goes, this will apply to annuals as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But when it comes to perennials, there's a couple other steps you might want to take. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that in a lot of cases with herbs, especially, even if the package says to direct seed, in your particular area, that might not work. They just say, you know, plant in the soil after the first frost. And you might do that and see absolutely nothing happen. That's what always happens here. When I very rarely, in fact, I can't think of any herb that I've done that with and it worked for me. So when it comes to any herbs, I've always found it best to start the plants in late winter, early spring indoors. And then if you have a greenhouse, once it starts to get warm enough out there, then you can move that pot out to the greenhouse, or you can just leave it in the house. And then from that point, once it's warm enough outside and you know there's not going to be any more frost, and you've got at least a few inches on your plants, you can go ahead and plant them in the ground if you want. However, it's going to depend on your area. What I have found best with plants such as lavender especially, but I've done this with echinacea, marshmallow, and more, and that is to just graduate it as it grows a little bit bigger into a bigger pot, because I'll start them in 4-inch pots usually inside, then graduate it to a bigger pot. This may be, let's say, about that big, and then just leave it in there for the rest of the season. And then in the spring, once it starts growing again, and I see it's got good healthy growth and it's at least a good maybe 5-6 inches tall, then it can go shorter than that, but I like to make sure I have a good healthy root before I try to transplant it in the ground, and then I will plant it where I want it. I found some herbs do best that way. Now I did that this year with the licorice. I've tried to grow licorice a few different times by first direct seeding it. I got some to start growing and they just petered out. Well, this year I decided to do the method that I found worked best for starting marshmallow, because I had to do that a few times, the lavender and so on. And that was, I started it in a 4-inch pot, and once they got about this tall, I transplanted them into a bigger pot and moved them out onto the deck, but only once it was warm enough that I know it could be okay out there. I tried that with the astragalus, but the astragalus ended up dying back because I moved it out too soon. So I'll have to try that one again if I want to get that one to grow. So what I've done is I left the licorice in the pot that it's in, and the day that I'm shooting this video is actually, I think, November 5th or 6th. I don't remember what day it is. And I took this picture this morning of my licorice plant in the pot. And the pot's about this big. So about a week or two ago, I moved it right up against the house. It was out on the edge of the deck where it could catch more sun. But in the wintertime, that's the south side of the house, we do get, since the sun is setting lower, we get quite a bit of sun right there. And then being up against the house, and since it's in a pot, that's going to help keep it more insulated and warmer. And then in this coming spring, once I see it start growing again, I expect it to die completely back like most perennials will do. Once it starts growing again, I'll figure out exactly in the garden areas where I want to plant it in a more permanent location, because I don't want to keep it in the pot. Anything that you're growing for the sake of the root, especially marshmallow, echinacea, licorice, any of these things, you do want to either put them in a really big pot or put them in the ground. They're always going to do best in the ground. But it's not saying you can't grow it in the pot. And since I'm trying to grow the licorice more for the root, the echinacea I actually grow more for the flowers and leaves. I've never yet to use the roots off my own plants. When it comes to those ones I'm using for root, I like them to grow for several years before I even bother touching the root. So the marshmallow root, I gave it 2-3 years before I even started harvesting any root. And it's really recommended to do that because you want it to get well established. So now let me come back to annuals for just a minute. Certain annuals like calendula is an annual technically. However, if you grow your calendula in the right place, then you can get it to last for 2 years. Even though calendula can self-seed and you can get lots of calendula plants, again, that's going to depend on your area. So far, I have only had a calendula one calendula plant that self-seeded from the previous years and then came back, and that was this past year. I've never seen that happen before. And I know that has to do with our climate. So what I do is I always collect the seed from that year, and then I start it again in the spring, and usually I wait till later spring, and even then I still find it best to start them in the greenhouse, or at least in a pot outside where it's going to get the most warmth yet stay protected, because sometimes our springs can go back and forth from being really hot to really cold. And so I know that's why the calendula struggles a lot of times until summer, when we finally have a little bit more consistent warm weather. So I'll start them in the greenhouse, and late spring I find it best. And then once they get a sufficient amount of size, I may still transplant them into a pot. Now, calendula is also known as pot marigold because they can do very well in pots. But I don't like to necessarily leave them in the pots because I want them to come back in the spring. So if I can put them, either move the pots up like I do with the licorice root, moving it up closer to the house so that they will stay alive through the winter by being protected, and then they will give me a lot of flowers come spring, because that's a great thing about calendula. If you can get it to come back in the spring, it'll get huge, and you'll get so many more flowers off of it in that second year than you did the first year. And so I have right here on the south side of the house, I have a really narrow little garden bed that mostly now I'm growing calendula in because it's right up against the house. It's on the south side, so it gets lots of sun. And I have already had some calendula come back this year from the year before, and then I put even more plants out there, and I'm hoping they'll all come back. I'm interested to see if it's possible I might even be able to get a third year. We'll see. And of course I'll keep you updated on that in 2022, and if they'll start growing again. Usually what you'll see with calendula, you can get a pretty good idea if it's going to come back. It'll kind of die back, but if it still has even just the smallest amount of green on it through the winter, come spring, then that's a pretty good sign it's going to start growing for you again, because it never completely died back. So certain things you can do that with. Pansies you can do the same thing with usually. You can oftentimes get another year out of them, maybe 3 years even, if you can keep them protected in the winter. And that's of course if you live in a place that has harsh winters. We don't really have harsh winters, but they get cold enough that most things are going to die back. If you don't really have a winter to speak of, you might have your plants just keep growing all through the winter time. It just depends on where you live. I'm just sharing with you what's worked for us in our very cool and wet climate. Again, we're very close to a rainforest here in Washington State. We're like the wettest part of Washington State. So if you live in a climate like that, these might be better tips for you. But even if you live in a warmer climate and drier climate, these might still be helpful. I can't be certain, but you can give them a try. A lot of times what I'll do as well, I wanted to add this, is with some things I'm unsure about, whether it be a vegetable or an herb, I will start some in a pot and then I'll direct seed some. I'll do that a lot with squash. I'll start some in the greenhouse in a pot, but then I'll also direct seed some and then compare them. Some years, the ones that I started in the greenhouse will do better, and some years the ones I direct seeded later, once it warmed up, did better than the ones I started in the greenhouse and transplanted. So I recommend, if you're uncertain, do both and just see what works best, whether it be with herbs, fruits, vegetables, no matter what it is that you're planting. Okay, well, I hope you found this helpful and gave you some tips of what you can do for your 2022 garden, or if you're watching this much later than that, then your 2023 and so on. And also, don't be afraid to put some of your own tips down below, what works for you when you're starting, especially herb seeds and in particular perennial seeds, because sometimes mints in particular can be a little more difficult, mints, lavender, so on, to get started. But once you have them established, they usually do very, very well. So share with us down below. Thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.